It's a pleasure to introduce Asmeret Berhe. And as you can see, she's an associate professor at UC Merced. And I know Asmeret mostly because I shared an office with her husband years ago. He was a PhD student here. And so she has some ties here at USU. And she earned her bachelor's degree in Eritrea at Asmara University there. And her MS degree was at Michigan State University. And then her PhD she earned at UC Berkeley. And we're happy to have her speaking to us again today. If any of you were here last night listening to her talk, you know, she does a great job of presenting her work, and it's very exciting research that she's involved in. So, welcome.
Thank you, everybody, for the invitation and being here. And Scott and Ido, it's a pleasure to talk to you. I hope you all enjoyed yesterday, hopefully, and we'll do a slightly different talk today. So today I'll talk a bit about how fires affect soil carbon. But a lot of my talk will really focus on pyrogenic carbon, which is specifically that pool of carbon that is altered by fire. And I'm going to talk about how we actually isolate it and how we look at the pyrogenic carbon separately as opposed to total pool of carbon that could be altered by fire. Before I move on, I just want to acknowledge that this is obviously a lot of collaborations, a lot of hard lab and field work that lead to these results. And I particularly want to acknowledge my graduate students, Samuel and Rebecca and Fernanda, who's a lot of the work that I'm going to talk about today is either from their thesis work or Fernanda's postdoc project. Okay, so my main messages are very simple. That I'm going to try and convince you that fire is a very important driver of not just ecosystem processes and vegetation dynamics, but also soil-related processes. And I'm going to focus on how fire increases the rate of erosion and even redistributes and dictates kind of how carbon's going to be distributed and how much carbon's going to be in different parts of the landscape. And then at the end, I'm going to talk to you about how fire affects the persistence of the specific pool of carbon that I mentioned, pyrogenic carbon. With that, I'll just move on to my introduction and just kind of make sure we're all on the same page that fire is everywhere, right? Somewhere about up to 8 million square kilometers of land are burned on an annual time scale. And this doesn't just lead to devegetation, but there's also significant release of greenhouse gases that's associated with fire. A lot of biomass is consumed, and then a very significant amount of 4 different greenhouse gases that I've listed is released into the atmosphere because of fire. And obviously, we're growing a lot concerned because of fire and what fire is doing to the terrestrial ecosystem, because over the last few decades in particular, especially in the western part of the US, the fire dynamics has been changing significantly, largely because of climate. And this is data that is compiled and reported regularly by the National Interagency Fire Center. Where you see basically is that if you follow the black line, that's the total area that is burned, and the red line is the actual individual number of fire events that occurred. So what becomes very clear is that at least since about the mid-'80s, the number of fires has actually not been changing significantly. But those fires that do happen in the landscape are becoming a lot more catastrophic. Bigger, they burn a lot of area, they damage a lot more forests, and even human dwellings. I'm sure you've been following in the news in Northern California this week. So fires, because of changing climate and drier conditions in the West, are becoming a lot more larger, catastrophic. And so it becomes important to think about not just how fires are changing soil or ecosystem processes, but also how fire severity could have very different implications for, say, when we consider low-intensity fires versus high-intensity fires. And part of our work is going to address that. So I want to start kind of with what we know about fire effect on the soil ecosystem, right? Obviously, a lot of the vegetation and carbon that's near the soil surface is combusted, And when you have organic matter combusting, you have change in not just carbon, but also nitrogen and phosphorus concentrations near the soil surface. Hence, you have change in availability of plant essential nutrients in soil. And we also have formation and deposition of fire-altered matter that I mentioned, this pyrogenic material or char, right? There's a lot of char left behind in different pieces and different sizes and burned at different temperatures in the landscape. All of these are figures that were taken about a month after the rim fire in California. I'm going to talk quite a bit about the rim fire later on. But fire also leads to change in hydrologic flow paths because it leads to deposition of volatile organic compounds, typically a couple of centimeters below the soil surface. And what that does is then it makes it very hard for water to penetrate into the soil surface because you now have these hydrophobic species, organic compounds, that reroute water or at least let it pond near the soil surface. And instead of infiltrating down into the soil profile, it washes off on the surface and taking along with it whatever's on the surface. And in fact, this is in a site of a fire that happened in South Lake Tahoe called the Gondola Fire. Some of you might know the popular resort, Heavenly Resort. It's a pretty big resort in South Lake Tahoe. The story goes that people were riding on the gondolas that they have to go up the ski slopes. But this was dry season, obviously there was no skiing, but somebody dropped a cigarette into the forest, and the whole forest got torched. 10 years later, we go back into that site, because that was the site of one of the studies that we'd done. You see that water doesn't get infiltrate. And this is, you have to remember how significant this is. These are soils and high elevation systems in the Sierras. They're very coarse, sandy soils derived from granitic alluvium in many cases, or granitic parent material. So they're very, very coarse soils. So when water has a hard time penetrating here, it really means something, and even 10 years after the major fire event. And so, but I also want to acknowledge that obviously how much fire affects soil or hydrologic flow paths and other variables depends on the intensity of the fire, how much fuel is there that's available in that system to burn, the environmental conditions that dictate, again, fire intensity, fire severity, including humidity, wind, topography, and other soil variables that we're more familiar with, including moisture availability in soil and similar things. So in my work, we try to understand, I talked yesterday about the role of erosion in carbon dynamics, right? But I think it's important to think at another level how there are multiple drivers that are actually acting on the soil system at the same time. So in these fire-affected high-elevation systems that we study right now, carbon dynamics is not just dictated by erosion or just climate because it controls largely NPP and respiration, but also there's this occasional fire that comes into play. And fire intensity and amount of fire obviously is also responding to climate, and the implications on carbon dynamics are modified by erosion. So it's kind of complicated set of variables, if you will, that are interacting to affect soil carbon dynamics. And we try to recognize that these drivers are overlapping both in space and time, because in many cases, especially in the western part of the US, large storm events follow fires, maybe a few days or weeks after the fire events. And when that soil is having a hard time getting wet because of hydrophobicity and there's a lot of pyrogenic matter, then that leads to some massive sedimentation events and runoff events. So I just want to kind of show you some ideas about how this change in hydrologic flow paths can be really important with fire. So you can imagine that if a hill slope, vegetated hill slope was, receiving water from precipitation, you would assume that most of that water, especially in a high elevation Sierra system, like I'm talking with coarse soils, most of that water would infiltrate, right? And when it flows eventually downhill, then it's going to flow through subsurface flow mechanisms, not necessarily surface. But if you remove all of that vegetation and then there's a hydrophobic layer that's created near the soil surface, then that infiltration is going to be limited quite significantly, actually, and that most of the water is going to move on surface flow, and hence why you have large runoff and sedimentation events that bring a lot of these fire-altered material into streams and other aquatic bodies. And I'm particularly interested in thinking about, so how does fire mobilize from these hill slopes both particulate and dissolved forms of particulate matter or even overall carbon? And we're through these mechanisms that I mentioned. And one way you want to think about pyrogenic matter is, one, we recognize that it's chemically distinct from other forces, the types of carbon. Because once carbon is charred, or organic matter is charred, most of the easily decomposable components like cellulose and other aliphatic groups or simple proteins are very easily burned. So what's left behind are these condensed aromatic groups that are much harder to break down for microbes. So chemically, first of all, it's distinct. But then you also want to think about the fact that this pyrogenic matter is actually right there on the surface, right? So that affects its transportation. But also, because it is these fire-altered components typically tend to be small and have a lot of reactive surface area, they also tend to play very important roles in water and nutrient absorption and dynamics in the soil after the fire. Another thing I should mention is also that because it's really recent deposit near the soil surface, doesn't really form any association with minerals. So there's nothing to protect it. So when that next precipitation event happens, then in particular if it's rain, then it flushes all of that out quite readily. In fact, this is an observation that Lee McDonald made in Colorado a while ago. This was the first rain event that happened post a really big fire event called the Saloon Gulch Flume fire, the Hayman fire, in the Saloon Gulch Flume. All that material that you see, that black matter, was all transported in that one event. From that catchment. It's a fairly small catchment, relatively speaking. But what's important to note is how distinct that fire is. So when we say, there's large transport of pyrogenic matter post-fire, it's in recognition that people have made these observations for a long time. We're just trying to quantify it now by using some spectroscopy to help us distinguish between the total carbon that's moving versus that fire-altered carbon. Okay, so the presentation that I'm going to follow is going to first talk about some laboratory heating experiments that we did to think about how the form, distribution of carbon, and even its dissolvability in water changed as a function of heating temperature. And then we're going to talk about transport of both bulk organic matter and fire-altered matter, and then how pyrogenic matter selective transport implicates its persistence in the soil system. So the soils that I'm going to use for the next set of experiments that I'm going to talk about are all derived from these climosequence of soils that exist on the western slopes of the Sierra Nevada mountains. Keep in mind that the western slope of the Sierra mountains, all these soils are formed from very similar granitic parent material. They've all been undergoing soil formation or weathering for roughly about the same time, but the climate is very, very different as you go up the elevation, obviously. And hence, you have fairly weakly developed soils. You start out from here in the lower elevation sites, and then when you get to that mid-elevation zone, the soils tend to be very well weathered, rich in clay, rich in reactive soil minerals, including iron, aluminum oxyhydroxides. And then you go on, and weathering and biological productivity, again, get limited by climate because it's fairly cold and it's mostly snow-covered for a big part of the year. So we chose these soils because they represent a range of mineralogies and the range of soil carbon concentrations and nitrogen concentrations that when we look at then how much carbon is affected by soil or by fire, rather, we wanted to see if the effect is the same across soils that are different in mineralogy, aggregation, and things like that. So, and these heating experiments, what we wanted to do was think about what temperatures and at what rate do we actually even want to heat them in the lab, right? We are very, we're all should be upfront here. Laboratory heating is not equal to fire, right? We're just trying to think about how that input of heat is changing the composition of organic matter in soil conditions. And so to guide us in this endeavor, we followed some of these early works that showed that if these folks that are a lot more braver than me, they put thermal sensors in forests right before they burn in different types of soils and measured temperature profiles and change in temperature after fire starts. And what you see is at the mineral soil surface, fire temperatures can go up to like 700. But soil also happens to be a very good insulator, especially if it's dry and you don't have a lot of water. And in that case, then, once you go like a couple of centimeters below the soil surface, first of all, that peak is a lot more delayed, and it doesn't even barely gets to 300, right? We're only talking about 2.5 centimeters below the soil surface. You add another 2.5 centimeters, and the peak is now even less than 200, right? So it's a very, very effectively insulated system. So we said, okay, then we'll start from these lower ranges and try to approach that. But in full recognition that most of the fire or most of the carbon in soil is not going to see those peak temperatures. And to make sure that everything that we're providing putting in the furnace is heated really uniformly, we packed soil into the ceramic containers and heated them fairly slowly and exposed them for the same amount of time, but at different temperatures. And then you make a couple of quick observations, right? First of all, note that they start from very different percent carbon, right? These are all percent carbon plots for the different soils at different elevations. In the mid elevation, like I mentioned, you have a lot more carbon, especially in these music side, because this elevation band in the Sierras happens to be fairly warm, and there has plenty of precipitation, but it doesn't get covered by snow for really long periods of time like you have down here. And down here, obviously, in the valley, it's really dry and not really wet for most parts of the year. So we have the least amount of carbon here. But the message I think that you quickly get from this is that there's a similar pattern here, even though it starts from different percent carbons, right? Most of the carbon is lost by about 450 degrees centigrades, but the biggest change occurs in this range between around 250 or so, at least that band between 250 and 350 degrees centigrades. In fact, if you plot this data in a slightly different way, and not just look at the percent carbon, but go back and relate it to the initial carbon you started out with and think about what percent of the initial carbon that I started with actually was lost at different temperatures, then it gets even a lot more consistent pattern, both for the carbon and the nitrogen, right? By about 450 or so degrees centigrade, you lose most of the carbon, 95% of the carbon. So the next thing we wanted to think about was, where's that carbon that's being lost? Or if I go back and look at the distribution of carbon, say, in particulate pools, in macro aggregates, micro aggregates, or the small pools associated with clay and silt, does that change too? And so that's what we did in the next set of experiments. And we looked at, mostly focused our studies on the micro and macro aggregate ranges, where the idea here being that a lot of the carbon that's associated in the macro aggregates is going to be fairly particulate and also more recent and new carbon. But when I get to the micro aggregate and even the carbon associated with the primary minerals, I'm getting into carbon that has been probably in the system for a while. It's highly decomposed, perhaps colloidal, and even might have been in the dissolved phase and was sorbed into the surfaces of the minerals. So we're looking at very distinct pools of carbon, right? So with that in mind, then, we first tested the aggregate stability, just the wet water stable aggregation for these soils. And just similar to what we observed with the carbon data that I showed you, we see a lot of change between that 250 and 450 degrees centigrades, right? And if you think about then, if you have aggregates and the aggregate stability is changing, and you can think about, okay, what is changing in that mixture because of fire? The aggregate has some minerals, and it also has some carbon, organic matter components in there. And we shouldn't expect the mineral particles to be changed significantly at this temperature range. In fact, we've done XRD on all these samples, and we don't see any change in the mineralogy until about we hit 550 or so degrees centigrades. So the only logical explanation is then when the carbon starts to change, or when you start losing carbon and combusting carbon, the organic matter that was serving as a glue to hold these aggregates together then breaks down. And so you see this aggregate stability changing. And then when we do the physical fractionation steps to separate the remaining carbon into different pools, we see distinct patterns where the carbon that was associated with macro aggregates is the one that is the most hit, right? That significantly reduces. And I want to be clear here that all of these plots obviously are plotting to 100%, but it's 100% of that carbon remaining at that temperature range. Right? So remember that the carbon is dropping quite significantly. But at any given temperature range, we got what we got, and then we're trying to separate it into different pools. And so you start seeing, especially after the peak that are around 250 or so degrees centigrades, carbon distribution in these macroaggregate pools drops. And so the logical explanation is there, the carbon burn that was holding those macroaggregates together, and now you're recovering most of it in the smaller aggregate size ranges, or even in association with the silt and clay size particles. It should also be technically harder to burn that carbon that is bonded to the surfaces of the minerals than the particulate carbon that's just sitting inside aggregates that are breaking down, right? The data is even more dramatic when you think about nitrogen. Because for several of these soils, by 350 degrees centigrade, we burn off all the nitrogen that is associated with macroaggregates. So the rest of the tiny percent of nitrogen that is left behind at that point is all associated with either microaggregates or is chemically bound to the surfaces of the minerals. Okay, so the next thing that we did was think about, okay, so clearly the chemistry of carbon, its distribution is changing, same goes for nitrogen, but we wanted to think about, okay, so what if I was an aquatic person, and I'm thinking about how is that going to change the nature of the water that's flowing out of soil, right? I'm hoping this appeals to the aquatic folks in the room. And one way you want to think about this then is when soil is treated by heat, right? And the organic matter nature changed, and these aggregate dynamics are changing, infiltration dynamics are changing in soil. So technically speaking, we should see change in the nature of the organic matter, the chemistry too. But we wanted to get a very good way of looking at that. And so we set up an experiment with all these soils burned. We stopped doing this after 350 degrees centigrade, because you remember if I showed you, there wasn't much carbon left after that point. So we just did cold water extractions in the lab. Obviously, as you can see, the soils that start out with a higher concentration of carbon, you extract a lot more carbon in the dissolved pool. But we were really interested in not just the concentration, but the chemistry of the carbon. Then we kept running into a problem that there wasn't really a good method to do this. Because we can do aromaticity using UV-Vis or do IR for bulk characterization, but none of those techniques tell us about whether the proportion of aromatic groups, in particular the condensed aromatic groups, is changing in the dissolved phase. So we resorted to adapting a Proton NMR technique that a lot of people use in water, some chemistry applications, and some folks had started using it with stream water too. But anyway, we worked really hard to try and get it to work for us. But I'm going to talk about Proton NMR right now and then 13C NMR later. So I thought it would be nice to make sure that we're all on the same page about what NMR does. So NMR is basically this technique that you can use on certain nuclei for certain elements. It's not for every element. But typically, it's the rare elements, the stable isotopes that you can use. And it's useful if these nuclei are magnetically active and they possess magnetic spin that allows them to resonate when they're exposed into a magnetic field. So what that means basically is that depending on the magnetic field strength that I expose a mixture of compounds that are in organic matter, those protons or the 13C nuclei would resonate differently depending on the magnetic environment they find themselves in. So think about this, for example. So if I have a 13C nuclei that is bonded in a single bond with another carbon versus hydrogen or oxygen versus another nitrogen, or if there's a double bond or an aromatic structure involved, it resonates differently. Hence, we can basically extract that signal on how it's resonating to be able to tell what kind of functional group must this carbon be in. And the intensity of resonance that we get at different magnetic field strengths tells us about how the different pools of carbon are represented. And you could do this, as I said, with proton, or you could do it with 13C. So you have to keep in mind that if you want to do this with proton, where the proton is already part of some organic matter and water and soil, you want to be sure that you're not reading the signal from the water and soil. So you first have to dry it, bone dry, get your water extract, we get it, and then we freeze dry it. Remove as much of the water as we possibly can until we're confident there's not much water left there. And then we reconstitute with isotopically enriched water, because then that has a very distinct signal, the D2O as opposed to the H2O. So we then can just cancel that part of the spectra out without worrying about the other effects. And so you can get a lot of information from NMR, distribution of all sorts of different functional groups from both Proton NMR and 13C NMR. So far, Proton NMR is really only useful with dissolved organic matter and water kind of samples. But 13C, you could use it both dissolved and solid state conditions. And as you can see, there's tons of information you can derive from here. I will be upfront and tell you that NMR in soils is a lot more messier than NMR that the chemists do, mainly because we have paramagnetic interference from things like iron and manganese that are part of the soil minerals. So we have to be very careful about how we remove that interference first and ensure that we have enough carbon that we can actually observe enough organic matter. But once we do all that, then we can get spectra for each, and we can go on interpret it. This is what a typical proton NMR for dissolved organic matter looks like. And I can get a lot of information out of this, in particular the distribution of different functional groups. So the simple aliphatics kind of thing, and even oxygen O or N substituted alkyls. And right near this part of the spectra, I can look at how the distribution of aromatic functional groups that I'm interested in is available in any pool of water. So the distribution of carbon in these different groups and the intensity of those peaks, you can integrate across multiple regions and just get what proportion of the carbon or organic matter in a soil is in this functional group versus that. And if I just want to know what proportion is aromatic and see how the proportion of aromatic carbon, which is presumably coming from pyrogenic species, if I didn't have it there in the first place from lignin or other things, how that's changing, I could look by just observing this region and integrating all the peaks that show up in that region. So this is what it would look like when you do it on all those soils that I showed you. So these are all the different soils. All of these are unburned, and these are burned at 150, 250, and then 350 degrees centigrade. A couple of things quickly jump at you when you look at this, right? One, yes, the aromatic region that I'm interested in starts showing a lot more activity when the soils are burned at different temperatures, right? But you also see change in the distribution of carbon organic matter into these different functional groups. In the low temperature kind of spectra, you have spectra that are dominated by aliphatics, oxygen-rich components, so cellulosic components of plants and things like that. But in the moderate temperatures, and when I keep going into this range, basically, a big proportion of the carbon that remains there is in the aromatic region. And if I then compare that with these, where I started with, remember, they didn't have a lot of lignin relatively to start with, then I can confidently say that these aromatic groups are now coming from these the fire-altered or pyrogenic species. And when I go on and integrate the carbon over these areas, and what you want to focus are these white regions and how they change, right, over the temperature ranges. Clearly, there's an increased contribution of pyrogenic carbon into this mix that we can identify. But as I mentioned, we also see evidence here that there is solubility and depolymerization of larger compounds that are now breaking down, especially at lower temperature conditions. And then kind of end up being a really neat technique to allow us to see how fire alters the composition of dissolved organic matter that's moving through the soil. So I want to be clear here that So this is a lab study, right? We extracted the leachates. So if this was going to move through the soil column and go through subsurface flow, for example, into a stream, you might not necessarily see that distribution of carbon, any of these distributions, for example, because that will depend on how the surfaces of soil and through that column that water is moving from can selectively sorb any of these functional groups. What's available in the soil to actually sorb any of these functional groups is going to play a major role in deciding what actually is going to come out at the bottom of that soil profile or flow on the subsurface to streams and things like that. Okay. So the next set of studies look at lateral transport of carbon post-fire. And for a big part of this, I'm going to take you to Yosemite National Park, an area where we studied after the rim fire that happened in 2013 and burned about a 250,000 acres of land. So the rim fire happened, started around, that's actually started in the Stanislaus National Forest, which is adjacent to Yosemite. This is the Stanislaus National Forest land. But within a few days, it moved really quickly and went into multiple areas in Yosemite. And we were really interested in this fire, so we were tracking it. So it was a pretty big deal, big fire event. And as you can imagine, this is the Western Sierras forest that we're talking about, right? There's a very complicated fire history here. Many of these areas historically have been burned. But the rim fire, kind of this whole area that is marked by red here, encapsulated areas that we know there had been fire over the last century or so, but there's also some areas that with no known fire history that were burned in this fire. So another thing that I should mention is that this was actually, at the time, the third largest wildfire in California history. Looks like this week there's a contender out there, but it was, at least in the Sierras, it was the largest wildfire that was ever recorded. It was really dramatic, and it took a full 9 weeks to contain. So it was a really, really big, and kind of speaks to that large intensity catastrophic fires being more common that we were talking about earlier. So another thing that I wanted to show you was, these are all pictures that were taken about a month after the rim fire when they were allowing people to go in and do some different studies. And the one thing that becomes very clear is that, yeah, there's plenty of pyrogenic matter here, right? Depending on the temperature of burn, it's either black in large pieces or even small pieces, or if it's burned at really high temperatures, it's even more ashy. You go in, about 5 months later, most of that char is not there. About a year and a half later, the land's starting to recover, so you don't see any traces of that. So the reason why I wanted to show you the studies is that historically people have argued that, one, there were two contradicting arguments. One, pyrogenic matter cannot decompose fast. But then when you go out and find and study different areas that were burned at different time periods, there was an assumption that all the loss that happened from the landscape was through decomposition, which was way too big to actually be able to happen with decomposition. So I argued for a long time that, nah, this was just moved down. It's just downhill, right? It can't make sense. There was no possible way that it would decompose, right, that fast. And so hopefully I will be proven right at the end of this talk. And so, just to also give you a couple of visuals of how different it is. So depending on fuel, soil moisture conditions, topography, and a whole host of other variables, fire intensity is different in the landscape, right? So we intentionally wanted to capture the dynamics at areas that burn at different intensity and different slopes. So the data that I'm going to show you later is going to compare fairly moderate severity burn areas and high severity burn areas. And this is a really different kind of view of what happened to the landscape after the fire. In the high severity burn areas, it's completely eliminated pretty much most of the vegetation, including big trees, right? So if you look up into the forest canopy, you don't really see much. But in the low and medium severity burn areas, the top canopy is really rarely affected. But another thing that happens there that's really important for this story is that soon after the fires, the pines needles from the forests and the trees actually starts falling into the ground. So not only do you now have charred pyrogenic matter on the surface from the understory vegetation that burns, but you also have this fresh needle cover that's falling into the surface. Okay. So we worked with folks at the National Park Service, and there were 21 sites identified for this particular work, and those 21 sites are distributed in these very light green circles that you notice on both sides. And these are both maps. This is showing you the soil burn severity, and the red being the most intensive. And this is showing you slope of the landscape in that same burn area, red being the steepest slope here. So all these 21 plots then were intentionally located in areas that vary in fire severity and also slope. So what we end up with then is 7 of these sediment fences being put in areas that burned at high severity, but that are also in high slope. So high severity, high slope, 7 in high severity, medium slope, and 7 in medium severity, high slope. So the idea here is that we have enough replication in the landscape that hopefully we can capture all the sorts of variability you can have in terms of rates of sediment transport, the nature of the carbon that's being eroded, and things like that. Oh yeah, and this is what the sediment fences look like. Very low key, low tech, but effective for trying to understand, how much material is moving from any part of this landscape. And the nice thing, what I really like, is it allows me to say that's the rate of erosion at that point in the landscape. Obviously, some of that material is going to go all the way down, but at least I have a way of characterizing how the rate of erosion varies at different points in the landscape. So if you look at this total sediment that's mobilized from this area, you notice that there's dramatically higher rates of erosion in the high severity burn areas. Remember, all the vegetation is removed, the soil is exposed, there's tons of ash and sediment and pyrogenic matter right on the soil surface, but presumably there's also a change in the hydrophobicity, which we didn't study in this case, but that you would expect in these all burned areas. So that leads to really, really large rates of sediment mobilization, in particular in the first couple of months when the rain events start. Right? Remember, it stopped in the fall. The fire was stopped in the fall, and these are the first rain events that occur in that area. But in the medium severity area, you don't necessarily see a massive increase in sediment transport, at least compared to the burn severity areas. Then when you go on and look at the percent carbon to nitrogen ratio, and selective transport of carbon, you start getting a much clearer idea. So the areas where a lot of sediment was mobilized, in total, there was also a lot of carbon mobilized, but simply because of function of how much sediment was actually moving. But then if I look at the carbon to nitrogen ratio of the sample, it doesn't really change much, even throughout the most of that first season, right? But until it starts to May being in this area near the end of the growing season, right? New vegetation is starting to come in. A lot more needles are starting to fall onto the surfaces, and even below ground vegetation is starting to grow. So the carbon to nitrogen ratio starts increasing and becoming more significant, which to me says there's a new source of carbon that's being eroded. Not just the one that was there during the fire, at least in the medium severity, but recognizing that plant is recovering very quickly, the coverage didn't change as much in there, then that makes sense. Then when you do the calculation for enrichment ratio, which is simply the concentration of carbon in the sediments that are eroded compared to the source soils that are delineated above each of these sediments, you indeed see that there is a much bigger enrichment ratio, larger enrichment ratio from these medium severity burn areas. Again, remember, there's a lot of fresh carbon in there, especially from the needles that fell on the surface immediately after the fire. So that makes sense. But the bulk carbon enrichment ratios, not so much. So there's a more selective transport of carbon overall in the medium severity burn areas than the high severity burn areas, regardless of slope of the landscape. But what I really wanted to know was is it pyrogenic matter, is it selectively being transported, right? So to be able to do that, I need to go back to NMR. So I take all these sediments and I run them through 13C NMR, and the data is very similar, as I explained, with the Proton NMR. But in this case, we look at directly the 13C that is part of the organic matter instead of the protons that are bonded to the organic matter. And then we get distribution of carbon in multiple functional groups. Right here, the first peak, for example, is lipids, waxes, cutins show up there. The next two peaks are simple proteins, are carbohydrates. So O and N substituted alkyls. The next peak shows aromatic functional groups. And that's the one I want you to focus as we move through the next set of the spectra in particular. In particular, how that peak changed relative to the others, because it's going to tell us whether that carbon that is remaining after fire or being transported, is it selectively enriched, for example, in pyrogenic matter in this pool of carbon or not. And then, so these are the spectra that we get for the different treatments that we have. First, I want you to look at the topsoils. These are the topsoils in each of these areas when you start out with. Remember I said most of that vegetation was gone, right, in the higher severity areas. And when I look at the carbon that is right on the topsoil after the fire, then I see a prominent presence of that peak that is representing aromatic functional groups, right? This is the high severity, high slope, high severity, medium slope. High severity, medium slope seems to have some lipids left behind too, but still very prominent aromatic peak. So a lot of char left behind in the soil. But if I look at that same kind of index for the medium severity burn areas, I clearly see an input of very new plant carbon sources. I could detect cellulosic matter, simple carbohydrates, proteins, and even some plant lipids. So there's clearly a mixture of charred matter that has this prominent aromatic peak, and then these other plant components. And then we move on to look at the sediments at the beginning and the end of that season that I showed you all the data that we collected. And then it clearly shows that sediment that is being eroded, though, is prominently enriched in aromatic groups. So hence, this is indeed selectively mobilizing that pyrogenic pool of carbon compared to what was in the topsoil. That is also true in the high severity medium slope. But in the medium severity high slope area, though, you still see very high transport of aromatic groups, but there's still a lot of other functional groups that are also coming in. So remember, this was bulk carbon was overall being transported, but not necessarily the fire altered. But here we have a clear signal that the pyrogenic carbon is being altered dominantly, hence suggesting that fire severity and geomorphology interact to select much more rapid transport of this fire-altered carbon in high severity burn areas than they do in the low or medium severity burn areas. We can also verify this by looking at 13C and 15N on all the sediments. So now I plotted all the data for 15N and 13C for the sediments that we collected throughout the season. And it becomes very clear that there is a mixture of sources of organic matter as indicated by 13C in the medium severity burn areas. Some of it is clearly burned, some of it not so much. But if I look at the N15 values in particular of the high severity burn areas, they all are in this area, suggesting that this is a lot of fire-altered carbon, or fire-altered organic matter that's moving through the system. And then I can take those areas that I integrate for the different regions on NMR and put that along with carbon and nitrogen ratios and some understanding of the system into a molecular mixing model that gives me what proportion of that carbon is actually pyrogenic. And then what that shows is that in the soil, after fire, regardless of where you're looking at, there's close to 40% or so of the carbon is pyrogenic. So the rest of the carbon was not altered, but at least about 40% or so is now pyrogenic. But then when I look at what's actually mobilized, though, by erosion, this is indeed a very clear selective transport of that pyrogenic carbon in the high severity burn areas, but not necessarily in the medium to severity burn areas. It's exactly what that figure shows if you just calculate concentration in sediment versus source for each of these plots, for each of these points. So I want to take this one step further, though, because yes, I got evidence now that post-fire pyrogenic carbon is rapidly being moved away from the hill slopes. And I also know from a bunch of other studies that we did that it doesn't really go that far. It's just deposited down the slope in depositional areas that are riparian areas, floodplains, or streams if they're really next to steep slopes. But it's down there, typically in the same catchment. And so we wanted them to go one step further and think about, okay, so if I consider an area that's flat and it got burned, and how long can pyrogenic carbon actually persist in this system? What if I consider a soil that's actually eroding up in a backslope position or something? where there is a net loss of pyrogenic carbon, as I showed you, especially after high severity burns. Or I go to the other part of the landscape and say, oh, well, what if it's actually a depositional site? So it's actually receiving carbon and not necessarily losing pyrogenic carbon because of fire. And so we wanted to be able to model how the rate, the turnover rate or persistence of pyrogenic carbon in the environment would change under these different conditions, even if you hold all the environmental variables that affect the decomposition constant. And to be able to do that, we just adopted a very simple soil model that I talked about yesterday. This is something that you probably all took and calculated stuff in ecosystem ecology. Yenny's model, right? Change of carbon over time is a function of input minus a rate constant for decomposition and then the amount of carbon you have in soil. But as I did yesterday, instead of just accounting that loss to oxidative decay, we put two different loss variables here, the oxidative loss and also erosional transport. Remember now that erosional transport term here is a net loss term for the hill slope, but it's a net gain term for the depositional site. And then I can solve that differential equation, assuming steady state conditions with all that might mean. But that's an easier way to do it anyway. So then, if I go back and look at, run this model for like 150 years or so, and then I can think about how much pyrogenic carbon do I still have in the soil if I assume that flat landscape, a hill slope versus a depositional setting. And these are the different data points that you get. The black is the flat landscape where I'm only assuming the loss is happening because of decomposition. And remember that I'm assuming a one-time input of pyrogenic carbon, right? Obviously, it could get a lot more complicated if you have multiple inputs. After 150 years or so, I get this much. But if I assume that erosion is causing loss of carbon, obviously I end up with less. And if the erosion is bringing carbon to the depositional site, I end up with more. And remember, since the ultimate change is a function of input versus the loss constant in carbon, then, and assuming steady state conditions again, I can go back and calculate the mean residence time or turnover time of pyrogenic carbon in these different soil profiles. And that's simply just an inverse of that rate constant, right? The sum of these two rate constants. And if I do that, then the turnover rate, assuming no erosion takes place or deposition, is close to 300 years or so. But if I consider erosional loss versus depositional gain of carbon, I can considerably change my estimates of how long pyrogenic carbon persists in the environment. So I care about this a lot. One, intellectual curiosity. I want to know about how different forms of carbon stay there. But if you're a water manager trying to manage how fire is going to affect your environment, in particular, you want to know how fast some of these components are going to come into your stream or reservoir, especially because you might have to filter it and add chlorine, and then you have problem with these disinfection byproducts that could end up actually being carcinogenic, then this matters a lot, right? If you know that a lot of pyrogenic matter is coming to you, you can be careful, especially if you know the fire conditions and the slope conditions that are surrounding your reservoir. But if not, we might have a lot of these unaccounted costs that can arise from just having to filter the water, having to treat it, and all sorts of other conditions. And of course, it's also a very interesting scientific question just for geochemistry, right? Okay, so I hope I convinced you guys that there are very significant changes in not just the amount, but also distribution and chemistry of the carbon and nitrogen species in soil that occur because of heating or fire, and that fire temperature has an important effect not just on the particulate matter that remains, but also on the water that's flowing through a soil to a dissolved water extractable pool. And I think what's really interesting for me is also that fire conditions impose really important controls on whether it's just overall fresh carbon that is going to be redistributed in the landscape, or if it is actually these fire-altered or pyrogenic carbon. And then the amount of quality of organic matter that is exported by erosion post-fire clearly also seems to depend quite a bit on not just fire conditions, but also modified by geomorphology of the landscape. That's it. Thanks.
Right. Can you tell us a little about what, does this involve any of the federal agencies maybe, and what is there a connection yet? Maybe this is too early to connection.
No, actually there was a connection early on. When we started working with them, it was because it became very clear that they were interested in erosion but from very different perspective, kind of the point I was alluding to early on. So the area that burned in Yosemite was very close to Hetch Hetchy, which is the water reservoir that the city of San Francisco uses. Hence, the San Francisco utility were really, really worried about how much sediment in what form is going to come to that reservoir after the rim fire. So they funded a bunch of work to be overseen by the National Park Service to measure how this erosion and the different fire conditions and slopes is going to change sediment mobilization. So, as I mentioned early on, those sediment fences were set up by the National Park Service. We ended up working with them, and my grad student, Rebecca, to her credit, did a lot of the work cleaning those sediment fences. But it was, from the beginning, a collaboration. And the major outcome that they actually wanted was, as for park management, but also for the utilities to be able to figure out what are the conditions that dictate how much sediment comes into the reservoir and in what form. And they're all really interested in this pyrogenic matter, because the worry is that if there's a lot of carbon in streams, when they, in different forms, but including in these aromatic forms, when they have to add chlorine to disinfect, to clean the water before they provide it to the folks in San Francisco, they have to worry about whether there are disinfection byproducts, the PAHs that form in that water that, as I said, are carcinogenic. So there's huge health concern there. And so they really, really want to know how does fire affect the movement of carbon in the landscape, not just sediment. Sediment they can filter out, relatively speaking. The carbon's much harder for them that they need to deal with. So they want to predict then ahead of time as much as possible. So it's kind of what we got part of our money from that.
Okay.
So.
I have two questions regarding the sediment fences. So the first is, did they all have similar contributing areas?
Yep.
Because I just found it a little interesting that the moderate slope, high severity had more sediment mass contributed than the high severity, high slope.
You mean?
Yes.
Part of this, though, I think, is because what happens with hydrophobicity. Because when you have fire conditions that are in the mid-severity range, I should go back. The initial kind of thing you want to take away from this is that this is a moderate severity slope, right? It supports a lot more vegetation. And if a lot of that vegetation is all of a sudden removed, then there's a lot more soil that's susceptible, because weathering is also fairly higher. Well, soil thickness is fairly higher. And as a balance of weathering and soil production and erosion, you end up with a much thicker soil, a lot more loose material that you can potentially erode that you had starting out here, right? So it's not surprising necessarily that you would mobilize a lot of loose sediment, because you just had a lot of loose sediment that all of a sudden lost its cover. But then the second issue that you maybe want to think about is, so this is a really patchy, the estimates that they do on the burn severity is based on reflectance and field observations and things like that. But it's entirely possible that there probably were areas around the high severity burn areas that were not burned at high temperature. And what that means is if they were burned at slightly lower temperature, they probably also have a lot more hydrophobic species left behind than high severity burns. Because if you burn soil at high severity, you just burn through everything, all the organic matter. It doesn't matter whether it's hydrophobic or not. But if there is, as I suspect, and again, this is very hard to verify after the fact, but if there was, when this was happening, that there was some areas that were patchy, the burn severity was patchy, and if there was areas that were burned at a fairly lower severity than the category of high severity that they generally put this area in, then it's entirely possible that there was a lot more runoff that was causing because of the hydrologic flow paths being rerouted. But the first question that you ask about sediment fences is to make sure that they were getting the sediment coming from them was from the same area. 100 centimeter square area was delineated and a ditch was dug around it, so that if any sediment came from above, it would accumulate in the ditch and not go into that area.
So the second follow-up question that is, as you just said, right, the high severity, you burned everything off, so that you have this really high fluid soils. With regard to this, the use of the term selective transport when you're looking at the sort of amount of aromatics in there, is it not just possible that in the high severity that that's all there is left, that it's not really selective transport, but it's the availability? Or did I miss something?
So there were some other species in the topsoil, right? There were other carbon functional groups in the topsoil that are not showing up in the sediments as much.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
So that's the topsoil after burn, but before erosion?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So then the selectivity is based on comparison of what we had in soil initially and then what is actually coming out in this sediment.
That's all.
Yeah. Cool.
Any other questions for Asmeret? Okay, well, we'd like to thank her for spending 2 days with us.
Thank you.